It was a crisp morning in a bustling city courtroom, where the air was thick with tension and the murmurs of people waiting for their cases to be called. Among them was a middle-aged black woman named Dr. Eva Sanders, her calm demeanor belying the storm she anticipated. Dressed in a modest yet elegant navy blue suit, Eva clutched her briefcase tightly, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She was no stranger to challenges, but today was different. Today, she would face a battle she hadn't prepared for. A battle against prejudice in its rawest form. At the front of the courtroom, presiding over the cases with an air of authority, was Judge Henry Carlisle. Known for his stern, no-nonsense attitude, the white-haired judge prided himself on upholding the law without compromise. But beneath his facade of impartiality, Judge Carlisle carried biases that, like hidden splinters, often surfaced in his decisions. He glanced at his docket, his sharp gaze landing on Ava's name. A slight frown crossed his face as he adjusted his glasses. When Ava's case was called, she rose with quiet confidence, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the bench. The room seemed to hold its breath. Judge Carlisle's eyes swept over her, lingering a moment too long. To him, Ava was just another defendant, another person in the endless parade of cases he saw daily. Yet something in her posture, her unshakable poise, gave him pause. A pause quickly replaced by an assumption that she was here to dodge responsibility. Dr. Eva Sanders, he began, the title dripping with skepticism, as if it didn't quite belong to her. You're here today for... He trailed off, reading the charge. A minor dispute, the kind that often got resolved with a small fine and a stern warning. Still, the way he looked at her, you'd think she was on trial for a far graver offence. Yes, Your Honour, Eva replied, her voice steady and respectful. She met his gaze, her expression neutral, refusing to betray any emotion. The room seemed to grow quieter as the exchange unfolded, all eyes bouncing between the judge and the woman who dared to hold her ground. Judge Carlisle leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the gavel. It's interesting, he said, his tone almost conversational. Someone with your background standing here in my courtroom. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Ava raised an eyebrow but remained silent, letting his words fill the room like smoke. The judge's decision was swift and pointed, the fine handed down with a firmness that bordered on punitive. I hope this serves as a reminder to take responsibility for your actions, he added, his words sharp and loaded. Eva accepted the ruling without flinching, but her calmness seemed to unsettle him. As she turned to leave, something unexpected happened. The prosecutor, a young man who had been silently observing, stood up abruptly. Your Honour, he began, his voice trembling slightly, I believe the court should be aware of who Dr. Eva Sanders really is. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, heads turning in curiosity. Judge Carlisle's brows knit together in confusion and irritation. And who exactly is she? He asked, his tone laced with disbelief. The prosecutor hesitated, his gaze meeting Ava's. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if granting permission. Taking a deep breath, he spoke again, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. She's not just Dr. Eva Sanders. She's one of the most respected economists in the country. She's advised presidents, authored groundbreaking research, and transformed communities with her expertise. His voice grew stronger with every word, the weight of the revelation hitting the room like a tidal wave. The judge's face froze, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. For the first time that morning, he was at a loss for words. The courtroom buzz grew louder, the whispers now a cacophony of astonishment and intrigue. Eva stood tall, her calm exterior betraying none of the emotions stirring within her. She met Judge Carlisle's gaze once more, this time with a quiet strength that spoke louder than any words could. He had misjudged her, and now the entire room knew it. But what would happen next? Would the judge double down on his decision? Or would he swallow his pride and admit his mistake? And how would Ava, a woman of such stature and accomplishment, choose to respond to this blatant display of bias? As the questions swirled, one thing was clear. This story was far from over. The courtroom remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the prosecutor's words settling over everyone like a thick fog. Judge Carlyle's face was unreadable as he looked back at Ava, his usual commanding presence faltering under the gravity of the revelation. This was no ordinary defendant standing before him. She was someone whose accomplishments and influence far exceeded the confines of this small courtroom. Yet, instead of relief or satisfaction, Ava remained as calm as ever, as if she had expected this moment all along. The murmurs in the gallery began to grow louder, an uneasy mix of admiration and curiosity. People were now whispering Ava's name, searching their memories for where they might have heard of her. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her every move, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted the strap of her briefcase, her gaze never leaving the judge's. "I'm sorry, did I hear that correctly?" Judge Carlyle finally asked, his voice tight. "You're telling me this woman," he gestured toward Ava with a flick of his hand, "is some kind of expert?" The prosecutor nodded firmly. "She's more than an expert, Your Honor. Dr. Sanders is a renowned economist. Her work has shaped policies on both a national and global scale. In fact," he added, glancing at his notes, "she was recently awarded the Global Economics Prize for her research on financial equity in underserved communities." The judge blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. His gaze darted back to Ava, who stood quietly, letting the prosecutor's words speak for themselves. He leaned forward slightly, his hands gripping the edges of his desk, as if grounding himself against the unexpected turn of events. "Well," Carlyle said at last, his tone edging on defensive, "that doesn't change the matter at hand. Regardless of her credentials, she's here because of a violation, and the law doesn't discriminate." He emphasized the last word, as though attempting to reclaim his authority in the room. Ava finally spoke, her voice even and deliberate. "I couldn't agree more, Your Honor. The law should never discriminate." There was a subtle emphasis in her words, one that did not go unnoticed by the courtroom. Her calmness, her choice to hold back instead of confronting him outright, spoke volumes. It was a quiet power that unsettled him more than any outburst could have. Judge Carlyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew he was losing control of the narrative, and he didn't like it. He glanced at his gavel, tempted to bring it down and end the discussion, but something stopped him. Was it curiosity, guilt, or simply a realization that everyone in the room was watching, waiting to see how he would handle this unexpected twist? The prosecutor, sensing the judge's discomfort, pressed on. "Your Honor, I think it's important to consider the full context of this case. Dr. Sanders wasn't trying to evade responsibility. If anything, she's here because she believes in the integrity of the legal system. Otherwise, someone of her stature could have easily resolved this matter outside of court." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting I treat her differently because of who she is?" "No, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied smoothly. "I'm suggesting you treat her fairly, as you would anyone else who has dedicated their life to bettering society." The tension in the room was palpable. Ava remained quiet, her expression unreadable, as though she were merely an observer in her own trial. Yet beneath her composed exterior, her mind was racing. She knew this wasn't just about the case. It was about something much bigger, a challenge to the very systems that allowed bias and assumptions to thrive. The prosecutor continued, addressing the courtroom as much as the judge. "Dr. Sanders has spent years fighting for economic justice, often in the face of skepticism and resistance. Her work isn't just about numbers. It's about people, families, communities, entire generations. She's made it her mission to dismantle systemic inequities, to give a voice to those who've been ignored. And now, ironically, she's here, standing before a system that seems all too eager to reduce her to a single moment, a single mistake." A ripple of emotion ran through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Judge Carlyle's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in his own courtroom. But as much as he wanted to dismiss the prosecutor's words as theatrics, he couldn't shake the feeling that this case had become about more than just a fine. He looked back at Ava, his gaze searching for something, an explanation, a justification, perhaps even a flaw he could latch onto. But all he saw was a woman who refused to be defined by his expectations. "Dr. Sanders," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, "is there anything you'd like to say on your behalf?" Ava paused, considering her words carefully. She knew this was a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for everyone watching. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm yet powerful, carrying the weight of her experiences. "Your Honor," she began, "I came here today because I believe in accountability. Not just for individuals like me, but for the systems and structures we rely on to deliver justice. I've spent my entire career working to create fairness in systems that are often anything but. So yes, I'm here to take responsibility for my actions. But I'm also here to remind us all that responsibility goes both ways." The room fell silent once more. Judge Carlyle stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he might respond. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking toward the gallery. The crowd, sensing the growing tension, waited with bated breath. The case had taken on life of its own, transforming from a minor legal dispute into a test of principles, power, and perception. What no one realized, however, was that the most unexpected twist was still to come. The weight of Eva's words lingered in the courtroom, a statement, a quiet yet powerful challenge to the very foundation of the proceedings. Judge Carlyle shifted uneasily, his usual confidence shaken by the unexpected turn of events. The tension in the room was palpable, every pair of eyes fixed on him, waiting to see how he would respond. But for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what to say. As silence stretched uncomfortably, Eva's mind drifted to the events that had brought her here. The charge was laughably minor, an unpaid parking ticket, the result of her forgetting to renew her car's registration amidst a flurry of back-to-back meetings. It was a simple oversight, one she'd planned to rectify immediately, but circumstances had spiraled in a way she hadn't anticipated. She remembered the morning she received the court summons, the notice stark and impersonal. The fine itself wasn't the issue. Ava could have paid it without a second thought. But something about the tone, the way it seemed to assume her guilt before she even had a chance to explain, struck a chord. It wasn't the first time she felt that subtle, insidious judgment, the kind that assumed her competence was the exception, not the rule. Her thoughts were interrupted as the judge finally spoke, his voice measured but lacking its usual authority. "Dr. Sanders, while your perspective is noted, the fact remains that laws must be applied equally. Any deviation from that undermines the very principles of justice." Ava tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "And what happens where the application of those laws isn't equal, Your Honor? When assumptions and biases influence decisions before the facts are even considered?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as spectators exchanged glances. Even the court clerk seemed momentarily distracted, her pen frozen mid-scribble. Judge Carlyle's lips pressed into a thin line. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice from the back of the room called out, cutting through the tension like a blade. "She's right." All heads turned to the source of the interruption. It was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a worn suit that suggested he didn't frequent places like this often. His face was lined with wariness, but his eyes burned with conviction. "You talk about justice, Your Honor," he continued, stepping forward slightly, "but how often does it really work that way?" The judge's gavel slammed against the desk, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "Order," he barked, though his voice lacked its usual bite. The man hesitated but didn't sit down. Instead, he glanced at Ava, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, before retreating to his seat. Ava's mind raced, piecing together the layers of conflict unfolding before her. It wasn't just her case under scrutiny now. It was the system itself. Her work as an economist had taught her to look beyond the surface, to analyze the root causes of inequality and propose solutions that address the deeper, often invisible structures at play. And here she was, living proof of the very issues she'd spent her life trying to solve. But there was another layer to this, one that she couldn't ignore. The judge's reaction wasn't just about her. It was about his own internal struggle, his unwillingness, or perhaps inability, to confront the biases that had shaped his decisions for years. She could see it in the way he avoided her gaze, in the subtle tension in his shoulders. As she stood there, waiting for the next move, her thoughts turned to the people she'd met throughout her career, those whose lives had been upended by the same kind of prejudice she was facing now. The single mother denied a loan because of where she lived, the small business owner whose proposal was dismissed without consideration, the countless individuals who had been judged not on their merits, but on assumptions and stereotypes. And then there was the prosecutor, still standing at his desk, his expression a mix of defiance and determination. Ava wondered what had compelled him to speak up in her defense. Was it professional integrity? A personal connection to the issues at hand? Or perhaps something deeper, a recognition of the opportunity to challenge a system that often went unchallenged? The judge cleared his throat, pulling Ava back to the present. "This is a courtroom, not a debate hall," he said, his voice regaining some of its authority. "We are here to address the facts of this case, not to question the broader implications of the legal system." Ava's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "But isn't that the point, Your Honor? The facts don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by the context in which they're presented. And if we ignore that context, how can we claim to deliver true justice?" Her words struck a nerve, and she could see it in the way Judge Carlyle's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might retaliate, but instead he leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking toward the prosecutor. "Do you have anything else to add?" he asked, his tone clipped. The prosecutor hesitated, glancing at Ava before responding. "Only that cases like this are exactly why the legal system exists, Your Honor. Not to punish, but to ensure fairness. And fairness doesn't mean treating everyone exactly the same. It means accounting for the unique circumstances and challenges each person faces." Judge Carlyle's expression hardened, but he said nothing. The room buzzed with tension, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone could feel the gravity of the moment, the sense that something important was unfolding before their eyes. Ava stood her ground, her heart steady despite the uncertainty of what would come next. She had faced countless challenges in her life, each one a test of her resilience and resolve. This was no different. But as she waited for the judge's decision, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger, a fight not just for her own dignity, but for the countless others who had been silenced or dismissed. And as the courtroom held its collective breath, she knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened next, she wasn't going to back down. The courtroom seemed frozen in time, every creak of the wooden benches and shuffle of feet amplified in the silence. Ava stood still, her gaze unwavering, though her thoughts were racing. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her, not just for herself, but for what this case had come to represent. Each second of hesitation from Judge Carlyle felt like an eternity, the tension in the room growing heavier with every passing heartbeat. The judge shifted in his seat, his stern expression betraying a flicker of unease. His gavel, which had once symbolized his control over the room, now sat idly in his hand, as if even he wasn't sure how to proceed. He cast a glance toward the gallery, his eyes scanning the sea of faces, many of whom now watched him with a mix of expectation and scrutiny. The courtroom was no longer just a space for legal proceedings. It had become a stage where deeper truths were being laid bare. Ava could feel the eyes of the spectators on her too, their curiosity mingling with quiet admiration. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight like this, not in such a personal, vulnerable way. Her work had always been about the numbers, the policies, the change she could create behind the scenes. But now she realized she had become the embodiment of her own cause. Her presence here was no longer just about clearing her name. It was about challenging the unspoken rules that govern not just this courtroom, but society at large. As the judge opened his mouth to speak, the courtroom doors creaked open, drawing everyone's attention. A young woman hurried in, her face flushed as if she'd rushed to get there. She carried a stack of papers, her hands trembling slightly as she approached the prosecutor's desk. The prosecutor leaned in, and she whispered something that only he could hear. His eyebrows shot up, and he nodded, motioning for her to hand him the documents. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Carlyle demanded, his voice sharp as he tried to reassert control. "This is highly irregular." "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, his tone calm but firm, "this is relevant to the case. With your permission, I'd like to present new evidence." The judge hesitated, clearly displeased at the interruption. "Proceed," he said reluctantly, leaning forward with a skeptical glare. The prosecutor stepped to the center of the courtroom, holding the stack of papers as though they were a shield. "Your Honor, these documents outline Dr. Sanders' contributions to economic policy reform. They include signed letters from government officials, academic endorsements, and even personal accounts from individuals whose lives have been directly impacted by her work. I believe these demonstrate not only her character, but also the broader context of why she chose to address this matter in court rather than resolve it quietly." The judge frowned, his skepticism deepening. "How exactly is this relevant to the charge at hand?" "This is a courtroom, not a lecture hall." "It's relevant," the prosecutor countered, "because it speaks to the very heart of what this case has become. This isn't just about a parking violation anymore, Your Honor. It's about whether we, as a legal system, are willing to confront the biases that influence our decisions, consciously or unconsciously." The room was silent again, the tension so thick it felt almost tangible. The judge's face hardened, but his eyes betrayed a hint of doubt. He tapped his gavel against the bench, though not with the force he usually wielded. "You're treading a fine line, Counselor," he warned. The prosecutor didn't waver. "With all due respect, Your Honor, this case crossed that line the moment Dr. Sanders walked into this courtroom. It's not about giving her special treatment. It's about ensuring she receives the same fairness and respect that should be afforded to anyone, regardless of who they are." Eva stood quietly, her emotions a complex mix of gratitude and unease. She hadn't expected the prosecutor to fight so fiercely on her behalf, and while she appreciated his effort, she knew the real battle was far from over. Judge Carlyle's expression was unreadable as he flipped through the documents, his jaw tight and his movements slow. Meanwhile, the gallery buzzed with whispered conversations, the spectators caught between admiration for Eva and the growing realization of the broader implications of the case. Some glanced toward Eva with newfound respect, while others seemed more focused on the judge, waiting to see how he would handle the mounting pressure. The judge set the papers down and looked directly at Eva for the first time in what felt like hours. "Dr. Sanders," he said, his voice quieter than before, "this courtroom is bound by the rule of law, not by public opinion or personal achievements. While your contributions to society are commendable, they do not exempt you from accountability." Ava took a deep breath, her voice steady as she replied, "I understand that, Your Honor. But accountability isn't just about individuals like me. It's about all of us, judges, lawyers, citizens, recognizing the ways in which our assumptions shape our actions. I came here today not to avoid responsibility, but to remind us all of the responsibility we share." Her words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Judge Carlyle's grip on his gavel tightened, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. For a man who prided himself on decisiveness, this moment of uncertainty was almost unbearable. He glanced once more at the gallery, where the eyes of the spectators bore into him, their silent expectations louder than any argument. The prosecutor stepped forward again, his voice calm but insistent. "Your Honor, I urge you to consider the precedent this case sets. This isn't just about one woman standing before this court. It's about the message we send to everyone who looks to the legal system for fairness and justice." The judge leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as he stared at the ceiling, as if searching for answers in the ornate patterns above. The room held its collective breath, the tension reaching a breaking point. It was clear that whatever decision he made next would define not just this case, but his legacy as a judge. And yet, even in that moment, Ava could sense that the battle wasn't just his. It was hers, too, a fight for dignity, for equality, and for the belief that even the most deeply entrenched systems could be challenged. As she stood there, waiting for the next move, she felt the weight of countless voices behind her, voices that had been silenced for too long. But what would the judge do? Would he cling to the status quo, or would he dare to step into uncharted territory? The answer was still unclear, the room teetering on the edge of a resolution that hadn't yet to come. As the courtroom braced for the judge's response, an unexpected commotion broke the tense silence. The doors swung open once again, but this time it wasn't a hurried assistant or curious spectator. A man stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. As the courtroom braced for the judge's response, an unexpected commotion broke the tense silence. The doors swung open once again, but this time it wasn't a hurried assistant or curious spectator. A man stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, he exuded an air of authority that seemed to rival even the judge's. Whispers rippled through the gallery as people tried to place him. Some recognized him instantly. Jacob Harrington, a prominent civil rights attorney and a figure known for taking on high-profile cases with systemic implications. His appearance here was unexpected, and it shifted the atmosphere of the room in an instant. "Your Honor," Harrington said, his voice calm but firm, "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe my presence here is necessary. I represent Dr. Sanders and have newly uncovered information relevant to this case." Judge Carlyle's expression darkened, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Mr. Harrington, this is highly unorthodox. We were on the verge of a ruling." "With respect, Your Honor, the truth cannot wait for convenience," Harrington replied, stepping closer to the bench. He held a folder in his hand, which he placed carefully on the judge's desk. Inside this folder are details about how this parking violation was processed, details that raise serious concerns about the fairness of the system itself. The judge eyed the folder warily, but didn't open it. "And what exactly are you implying?" he asked, his tone clipped. "I'm not implying anything," Harrington said, his voice steady. "I'm stating that there is evidence to suggest Dr. Sanders was targeted for enforcement in a manner inconsistent with standard practices. The violation she's accused of wasn't flagged automatically. It was flagged manually by an individual who seemed intent on ensuring it reached this courtroom." Gasps rippled through the room as the implication of Harrington's words sank in. Ava's composure faltered for the first time, her calm exterior giving way to a flicker of disbelief. She had anticipated bias, yes, but deliberate targeting. That was something she hadn't considered. Judge Carlyle's face grew taut, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his desk. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Harrington," he said slowly. "Do you have proof to substantiate them?" "I do," Harrington said without hesitation. He gestured to the folder. Inside are emails and internal memos from the Municipal Enforcement Office, obtained through a whistleblower. They show a pattern of selective enforcement disproportionately affecting individuals based on race and socioeconomic status. Dr. Sanders' case was not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger, troubling pattern. The tension in the room was now unbearable, every person handing on Harrington's words. Even the prosecutor, who had been steadfast in his defense of Ava, looked stunned. Ava's mind reeled as she processed this new information. She had always known the system was flawed, but to discover she had been deliberately singled out. It was both infuriating and deeply unsettling. Yet, as much as it hurt, it also steeled her resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It never had been. The judge, visibly rattled, flipped open the folder and began skimming its contents. His face grew more strained with every page he turned. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of paper as he read. When he finally looked up, his expression was a mix of anger and disbelief. "If what this folder contains is true," he said, his voice low but sharp, "then this case is about far more than a parking violation." "Exactly, Your Honor," Harrington said. "This case is a reflection of systemic issues that cannot be ignored. Dr. Sanders has become the face of a much larger fight, one that extends beyond the walls of this courtroom." Judge Carlyle's gaze shifted to Ava, his eyes searching hers for something. Understanding, forgiveness, she wasn't sure, but she held his gaze, unflinching, as if to say, asterisk, this is the truth. What will you do with it, asterisk? The gallery was buzzing now, the whispers growing louder as the spectators debated the implications of Harrington's revelation. Some were outraged, others intrigued, but all were captivated by the unfolding drama. The prosecutor stepped forward cautiously, his voice cutting through the noise. Your Honor, if I may, I think it's clear that this case has evolved into something far more complex than a simple infraction. I propose a recess to review the new evidence thoroughly before proceeding. Judge Carlyle hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to maintain control and the growing realization that this case was slipping beyond his grasp. Finally, with a reluctant nod, he tapped his gavel lightly. We will recess for 1 hour, he announced. Upon our return, we will determine the next steps. The room erupted into activity as people stood and began talking amongst themselves. Ava, still rooted in place, felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Harrington, his expression calm but resolute. This isn't over, he said quietly. Not by a long shot. She nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever was coming next, she was ready for it. But deep down, she knew that the battle ahead would not only test her character, but also shine a light on truths that many would rather keep hidden. The stakes had never been higher, and the path forward was anything but clear. When the court reconvened, the air in the room was electric. Spectators returned to their seats with a hushed urgency, their curiosity ignited by the revelations and the promise of more to come. Ava walked back to her spot, her heart steady, but her thoughts swirling. She had no idea how this would end, but she knew that whatever happened, this moment was bigger than her. Judge Carlyle returned, his face set in a mask of professionalism, though the strain was still visible. He called the court to order, his gavel striking the bench with a sharp crack that silenced the murmurs. Before we proceed, he began, I have reviewed the evidence presented by Mr. Harrington. The allegations outlined in these documents are deeply troubling and warrant further investigation. A wave of murmurs swept through the room, quickly quelled by the judge's stern glare. He continued, however, this court is tasked with adjudicating the matter at hand. While systemic issues may be relevant, my role here is to ensure justice is served in this specific case. Harrington stood, his expression calm but determined. Your Honor, justice cannot be served in a vacuum. Dr. Sanders is not just a defendant. She is a victim of a system that has repeatedly failed individuals like her. To ignore that context is to perpetuate the very injustices we claim to oppose. The judge's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed as though he would dismiss Harrington's argument outright. But then he turned to Ava, his gaze piercing. Dr. Sanders, you've been remarkably composed throughout this trial. Before I issue my ruling, is there anything you wish to say? Ava felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Your Honor, I stand here today not just for myself, but for everyone who has been judged unfairly, whether by the law, by society, or by individuals who let their biases guide their actions. This case may have started with a parking ticket, but it has revealed far more than that. If we walk away from this moment without acknowledging the deeper issues at play, we are failing to uphold the very principles we claim to defend. Her words resonated in the silence that followed, the courtroom hanging on her every syllable. Even Judge Carlyle seemed momentarily moved, his stern expression softening ever so slightly. But before he could respond, the unexpected happened. A member of the gallery, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, stood up abruptly. Your Honor, she said, her voice loud and clear, I work in the Municipal Enforcement Office, and I can confirm what's in those documents. The targeting wasn't random. It was deliberate. Gasps rippled through the room, the shock palpable. Judge Carlyle's gavel came down hard, demanding order. State your name and position, he commanded. The woman stood firm, unflinching under the judge's scrutiny. My name is Linda Pearson. I've been with the office for 15 years. I can't stay silent anymore. Dr. Sanders' file was flanked by my supervisor, who made it clear that certain individuals should be made examples of. When I questioned it, I was told to mind my own business. The room erupted into chaos, spectators and reporters scrambling to process this bombshell. Judge Carlyle's gavel slammed down repeatedly, his voice rising over the din. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. When the noise finally subsided, Vinda's confession hung heavy in the air. Ava's heart raced, the revelation both validating and deeply unsettling. She had suspected bias, but hearing it confirmed so plainly was another matter entirely. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Miss Pearson, are you prepared to swear an affidavit regarding your claims? Yes, Your Honor, she replied without hesitation. Judge Carlyle leaned back, his fingers steepled as he considered the implications. The weight of the truth was undeniable now, and it was clear he was grappling with the enormity of the situation. Finally he spoke, his voice measured but firm. In light of the evidence and testimony presented today, this court has no choice but to dismiss the charges against Dr. Sanders. Furthermore, I will be recommending an independent investigation into the practices of the Municipal Enforcement Office. The room erupted into applause, the tension breaking like a dam. Eva felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was tempered by the realization that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over. As the spectators began to disperse, Judge Carlyle addressed Ava directly. Dr. Sanders, while this ruling clears your name, I hope you understand the significance of this moment. It is a reminder to all of us, myself included, to remain vigilant against the biases that can cloud our judgment. Ava nodded, her expression resolute. Thank you, Your Honor. I hope this is the start of something better. But just as she turned to leave, Harrington stopped her, a peculiar glint in his eye. Dr. Sanders, he said, his tone quiet but insistent. There's something else you should know. The whistleblower who brought these documents forward, they insisted on remaining anonymous, but they left a message for you. Ava froze, her curiosity piqued. What did it say? Harrington handed her a folded piece of paper. As she opened it, her breath caught. The message was simple but profound. Asterisks sometimes change, starts with one small spark. Thank you for being that spark. Asterisk. She looked up, her eyes scanning the room as if hoping to spot the person behind the words. But whoever they were, they had vanished into the crowd. As Ava stepped out of the courthouse, the crisp air filled her lungs, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a deep sense of hope. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning.